For my adaptation, I scrolled through Wikipedia and there was one particular movie that caught my eye. I believe that this movie is a good adaptation of Frankenstein, in fact one of the best ones, because it follows two important criteria that are necessary for good adaptations. The movie that I chose is The Bride of Frankenstein, which is the spin-off, if you will, of the 1931 Frankenstein movie. This movie goes on to the story of what happens when the bride is actually created. It is one of the few movies that the sequel is believed to be better than the original. So what criteria are necessary for a good adaptation? For me, there are two qualities necessary, the first of which is faithfulness with the characters and the plot. The adaptation has to be faithful, not completely, but to the point of being recognizable as a version of the original. The second criteria for a good adaptation would be the purpose of the adaptation and context of the time period. For a good Frankenstein adaptation, we don't want a movie that was made for the audience that Mary Shelley intended in the early 1800s, but rather an updated version that is suited for viewers, in this case, in the mid-1930s. The first criteria includes faithfulness to characters. The bride is a character that never existed in Shelley's original book, but she was created for the purpose of this movie as an adaptation. This means that it's very unfaithful to the original, but was necessary for the updated movie. The monster existed in Shelley's original book, but in a much more intelligent and ferocious form than the character in The Bride of Frankenstein. His character remains fairly faithful to the original, but not completely, but the character qualities that differ from the original become important later. Frankenstein was the main character in Shelley's original book, but in The Bride of Frankenstein he serves mainly as a support character behind the monster and Dr. Pretorius, who I'll mention later. Frankenstein is forced to create the monster through blackmail, which evokes pity from the audience, which is not faithful to the original. Dr. Pretorius is a character who never existed in the original, but was necessary in The Bride of Frankenstein because we all know Frankenstein was not going to make the female, so they brought in Dr. P as a catalyst who forces the creation of the female monster. None of these characters were completely faithful to the ones in the original book. However, they serve their purpose for this adaptation, and they have good qualities that make them recognizable as an adaptation of the original, so that constitutes a good adaptation. Yay. The plot in the middle. The first criteria also includes faithfulness to the plot. The plot in the beginning of the movie shows the monster with a significant amount of human interaction, even though we know in the original he spent most of his time alone and in exile. This is not faithful to the original, but it makes for a much more interesting storyline. The plot in the middle of the movie shows the monster learning from and befriending an old blind man, whereas in the original he only observes him from a distance, but as we all know that would be a pretty dull storyline, so it is an unfaithfulness that is necessary in the adaptation. So the plot at the end of the movie is wildly different from the original because the monster actually decides to let Frankenstein and his wife Elizabeth go free while he kills himself, Dr. Pretorius, and the bride. This constitutes a happy ending, which the book definitely did not have. So the movie plot is not really faithful to the original at all, but it still includes the basic attributes that make it a good adaptation of Frankenstein. In this case, total faithfulness of the plot would have been a bad adaptation, so they pick and chose the good parts in order to make it a great one. For the second criteria, it is important for the film to be adapted to the time period. Bride of Frankenstein was released in 1935, which was right smack in the middle of the Great Depression, which most of us know what that is, so you have a little bit of an idea of what the context around this movie being released was. Bride of Frankenstein was also released after the original Frankenstein with the same director and actors of the 1931 movie. This ties into the purpose because a large part of why this movie was made was to act as a sequel to appease the audience of the original movie. Based on the context of the time period in the original movie that follows, the purpose of Bride of Frankenstein was to open up a whole new world of Frankenstein that piques the interest of the audience and serves as a spin-off. This purpose fits the demand of the time period and therefore makes it a good adaptation. Overall, with reference to the second criteria, which is the movie's purpose with reference to the time period, I can conclude that The Bride of Frankenstein is a great adaptation that was updated from its original version in order to fit the time in which it was released. Because of this purpose, the movie is definitely a good adaptation. Now that we have established that it is a good adaptation, we have time for some fun facts, one of which is that Colin Clive was actually a raging alcoholic during the filming of this movie, but the director still wanted him to play the character because he thought his craziness fit the character of Frankenstein. Bride of Frankenstein has had a huge impact all the way up to present day, where it is largely considered one of the greatest horror movies of all time, and this prolongs Frankenstein's relevance historically. The two criteria that make this movie a good adaptation are fulfilled with The Bride of Frankenstein, and being a good adaptation, this movie will continue for centuries to come as a timeless reference to the past that enhances the value of Shelley's original work. Frankenstein.